You're listening to Leadership Loading, a podcast that inspires leaders to be continuous learners and provides insight for those making the leap from the front line to the boardroom. My name is Jason McLaren, and I'm an Air Force firefighter veteran and safety expert turned entrepreneur and nonprofit director. I'm sitting down with industry leaders to talk about their leadership traits and lessons they have learned that can make an impact on future leaders. Hey everybody, my name is Jason McLaren. I'm the host for Leadership Loading podcast, and our guest today is Pablo Gonzalez, and he's here to talk to us a little bit about, this is part 6 of our 8-part series on resilient leadership. And he's going to be talking to us today about cultivating relationships and a few tips of what you can do to be a better networker. And welcome, Pablo. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, Jason, thanks for having me, man. My name is Pablo Gonzalez, here to add as much value as possible. I've been obsessed with human connection my whole life, and I've been using my ability to create and nurture relationships to fall upwards for the first 15 years of my career, and now I have been very purposefully doing it in a way that has allowed me to move across industries rapidly, start businesses quickly, and build a life that makes me really, really happy, man. I want to share it with the world.
Definitely. And I watched, you got a 4-minute video on your website, and I watched that, and it just pumped me up. I learned just in that 4 minutes, I learned like 2 things that I didn't even think of before. And, I was like, yeah, I need to get this guy on. So,
what were the 2 things?
Of course you're going to ask me that. Well, 2 things I didn't think about, like, when you're standing in line at events, like conferences or whatever, usually I'm kind of anxious because my last name starts with M. So I'm usually right. I'm like, okay, they usually divide it by, okay, A through N, get in this line, and M through whatever. So I'm like, okay, is this divided up like that? Or do I go just to one line? Or, so I'm too worried about making sure I get checked in right, rather than, talking to the people that are standing there. And then the other one was like, talking to the people that are just sitting around on their phone or whatever. And I do that. I'm that guy that's like sitting, okay, I'm going to act like I'm checking my email because nobody's talking to me, and I'll sit on my phone and then, turn into the wallflower.
It's such low-hanging fruit, man.
Yeah.
Like when you're sitting there, you're just like, God, somebody please come up and say hi to me, right? And then whoever says hi to you, you're like, oh, I like this guy immediately. So it's just such a low-hanging fruit thing, man. And the reason why it resonates is because everybody does it, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody gets to the line. I think it's funny, the division between L and M. I never thought about that, but that makes a ton of sense. But
Yeah.
in these conferences that I go to that you can pay like VIP, I sometimes do pay VIP depending on the conference,
Mm-hmm.
but when the perk is skip the line, I'm just like, cool, I'm definitely not doing that. I much rather, I'll get in the longest line and talk to as many people as possible because it's just like the perfect opportunity for a captive audience.
Yeah, I think that leads into my first question is, why should we do that? Why should we develop that network of personal and professional relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jason. I live my life by the quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson that is, in my travels, every man I meet is in some way my superior, and in that I can learn from them, right? And that essentially means that every single person that you've ever come across in some way or another is different than you. And that inherently means that they know something that you don't know. They have thought about something a different way, had a certain experience that gives you a certain perspective, practiced and refined a certain skill set, read a certain book that you haven't. There's always a little gem, a little nugget that you can learn from each and every person that you come across. And if you get really, really good at sussing that out, understanding it, and then relaying that information, you will be the smartest person in the room and the most interesting person in the room, and B, you have this ability to add value to yourself and everybody around you at all times based on this network and based on this database of learning from people and being able to connect people. And that's really, for the first, I don't know, man, 10, 12 years of my career, I felt like I said, I described myself as falling upwards, right? Like I felt really guilty about the fact that my career progressed in a really good fashion without feeling like I was burning myself out like everybody else around me that got to the levels that I got and in my friendship group. And at some point I just gave myself credit to say, no, man, what I've figured out is something that is a new way of learning and a new way of adding value, which is the aggregate, the aggregation of knowledge that you can learn in person to person, and the way to spread that information as well as possible. And I just there's no better way that I learn, right? Like there's no better way that I personally learn than by standing in front of somebody and just picking their brain, right? I know other people learn from reading, other people learn, or visual, audio, whatever. For me, it's this like interpersonal thing. And the more I look into it, the more I realize that this is just the way that humans are made, man. And it's a very like evolutionary thing. We are made to be in community. I like to say that human beings didn't get to the top of the food chain because we got these like sharp teeth and big claws, or we're strong, or we're fast, or we've got weird colors that allow us to hide. We got to the top of the food chain because at some point one caveman looked at five other cavemen and was like, "Hey man, if we work together, we can take out a woolly mammoth." you know,
Right.
you know, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you're talking about people having nuggets of wisdom and that sort of thing. I think that's why people like podcasts like this one, because, we're putting out those nuggets and hopefully building better people. And of course, this episode or this series is about building better leaders and more resilient leaders. And I think that kind of leans into our next topic is, building a strong base of support and how those personal relationships can do that. So, how can you expand on that?
There's really no way to get good at anything without practice, right? So I talk about it as its iteration, right? And I think it's one of the values that you are going through in your 8-step values has something to do with repetition or like change, or I forgot what it was, but right, but it's similar to iteration. And networking is the same thing, man. Relationship building is the same exact thing. I call it reps, man. So really, you're only going to get good at this. Some people are inherently good at it. I was inherently good at it, right? Like it comes from my first memory. I'm all right. So my name is Pablo Gonzalez. You're hearing me speak like this, right? Like I'm the most American person in my family. I was born in Venezuela. We left when I was a kid. My first formative memory is going into preschool and knowing that I'm the only kid walking in that didn't speak English, and having this like outsider that needs to figure out a way to belong, kind of like yearning. And that marked me for the rest of my life. And then, as a little kid, I was like the little kid that made friends with adults and things like that, right? So I've been doing it a long time. And I guess it's similar to Tiger Woods being able to drive a golf ball when he was 3 years old, right? So like I have a high ROI, I have the, inherent skill set, but to anybody else who isn't a natural sick golfer like Tiger Woods was at 3 years old, you can still, get a good golf game if you just practice enough.
Right.
So, what it is putting yourself in those situations, right? Like going to networking events, opening up conversations, approaching every person you come across as a potential person that A, you can learn from, and B, you can add value to their life. That is how you get really, really good at it. And then the rest is whatever tactics work for you, man. I've been able to take everything that's been working for me, and I've been thinking deeply about it for the last 5 years. So everything that I realize that works for me, that I'm able to get the perspective that it's a tactic, I synthesize it into a bullet point kind of story, lesson learned, and how people can do it for others. And that's how I go about my way doing
Yeah, I like that when you talked about when you're building those relationships, not you said getting value or giving value, but it's not about building that relationship for your gain. It's for what value you can give to the other person. And
it.
I think that is going to help support you because you're going to support that person and they're going to support you in your endeavors, which
Yeah.
then inherently, if it turns into a business deal, then it does. So.
Yeah, and on the other side of that, man, and I learned this language from Aubrey Marcus in a podcast. I don't know what him and Lewis Howes were talking about something, but if you approach relationship building from a service standpoint, then you can adopt this like Spartan mentality about it, right? Like Spartans would go to war, not hoping that they would live and win. They would go to war expecting to die and expecting to go out in like the glory of Sparta, right? So like if you're, because they were being of service. So if you approach relationship building as being of service and you walk into a networking event and you feel super douchey for the first half an hour because nobody's talking to you, but then at a certain point you make a connection and you're able to help somebody out, man, it's the best feeling in the world. And guess what? If you go into a networking event and all you do is like, talk to people and you never really connect the dots for anybody, but you're approaching it being of service, you're getting, when you leave, you're carried out on your shield, just like a Spartan who died in battle. And if you can approach it from that standpoint of service, man, it becomes really, really powerful for
you. Yeah, and that's definitely a way that your network can help you deal with hardships. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. Us as professionals and networkers, we have to, and leaders actually, a lot of times we think we have to bear that hardship, but when you have that network, you're able to kind of lean on other guys or other girls that have been through things and kind of see what they did and not have to do it on your own. You agree?
you. Yeah, man. I couldn't agree more. Like I on two levels, right? Number one, the more people you meet and the older you get, the more you realize that nobody has anything figured out. Right? So getting that perspective of, man, I might be suffering right now, but even the most talented person I've ever met in my life who I totally envy has suffered also. It gives you pretty good perspective to understand that life is a game of long-term momentum, but the short-term momentum stuff really messes with your head, right? Like I like to call it like an upward spiral, and when you're on the way up on an upward spiral, you're making these leaps, but there's certain moments where you have this like this like downward momentum. And if you get stuck in that downward momentum, that's when you make these like horrible decisions that will cost you inordinately. And if you have the perspective of having people in your network that can be like, no, dude, I've been through this, like this is what's going to happen right now. You're just in this moment. That's super, super invaluable. Cause I like to make the analogy of, you can save $100 a month for 10 years. And at the end of the day, you got like 10 G's in your bank account or something like that. But you can blow that on a crazy night in Vegas in one night. Right. So like, you don't want to make those mistakes when you're in that little short-term down cycle that's going to cost you inordinately all the good momentum that you brought up. And second of all, just access to opportunities, man. Like my story is that I was for 15 years in a construction career where I started off as an executive in training for a Fortune 500 company. And this was like in the 2000s. Then the world ended in 2009. And luckily I had become a green building expert. And through a connection, I was able to start a green building consulting company and have success with it within about a year and a half in Miami. And then I sold that. I got acquired by my biggest customer at the time and brought me in-house as director of sustainability. And then at a certain moment, during that time when I moved back to Miami from California, I got really involved in the community and I started a young professionals group for Habitat for Humanity. And that started me on this like whole other path of getting on boards of nonprofits and like doing all this type of community engagement. And a couple of years into being the director of sustainability for this big hospital builder, I realized that, man, these guys really just acquired me to just block this like one issue in their company and not really give me a career path. So I started trying to figure out how can I be more valuable. And I was able to leverage my network to then become a business developer. And now all of a sudden I became a rainmaker and I became much valuable. And then the day that I decided that I didn't really want to be in construction anymore, which is kind of my first day when I started working in construction, I was able to parlay the lessons I had learned through my network and through these experiences to go be VP of business development for a software company, for a software startup and form a partnership. And then a year into that, the stuff that I implemented was working great, but I realized the partnership wasn't for me. So at the beginning of 2019, I decided to start from zero, right? Like I just hit a reset button. I took a 90-day purposeful pause to figure out where I want to be in 10 years and reverse engineer the equation. And what I came up with was that I want to prove to the world that community creation is the future of business development. And man, that took about 6 months before anybody wanted to pay for that, right? Like I had to figure out through iteration what my value proposition was, what my product was going to be. But the moral of the story is I've gone in 2019, I started from zero again, after transitioning, making a hard transition into a completely different career, and then decided to reinvent myself. And within 1 year, I've been able to build a business that has 5 figures of recurring revenue per month, and I'm already scaling underneath myself. So in business, having this network has allowed me to transition. The moment that I felt stuck, I could rely on my network to open up opportunities to allow me to transition and redefine myself into whatever I needed. So at the end of the day, man, it's really been the most valuable thing in the world. And I really preach it to people that it's like, you can either be at work impressing your boss and impressing one person, or like 2 people that you report to, maybe 2 up the chain, or you can be out in society adding value to as many people as possible. And therefore they all know how valuable you are in your soft skills from a person to person thing, something that's not going to get you an interview in a resume, but as long as you have provided value to a bunch of people around you, then you have people completely vouching for you next time that you're making your next transition. And therefore you're not beholden to somebody else controlling your destiny. You have, I describe it as diversification of relationship assets, right? Like everybody talks about how, time is more valuable than money, right? So, and relationships are more valuable than money. So if the number one asset in investing money is diversification, why wouldn't you want to diversify your time and your relationships as an asset?
Definitely. And I like how you're talking about you basically made your own niche and pretty much your own space there and kind of built it out and were able to use those networks to bring in that clientele. So
Yeah,
that's
multiple times, by the way, right? Like when I became director of sustainability for this construction company in 2009, I didn't know anybody with a director of sustainability title. And then I was going to all these green building conferences, and like 4 years later, there was like 10 of them. You know what I mean? And not so you really can call your own shot as long as people know your soft skills value.
yeah. So you basically built the model and people were able to duplicate that. So that's always good. And I've seen that before in my areas too. So it's one of them things that, if you don't have the network, then nobody's gonna do it. So
Correct.
yeah. So you talked a little bit about this, how your network can help you achieve your goals, and how can networking help in developing your perspective on things.
Is that you're asking me that question?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what I said before, right? Like, if you have, I'm an experiential learner, man. So just the ability to take that Ralph Waldo Emerson quote and apply it in real life, right? Like that is what people mostly give you is perspective, right? So like the more perspectives that you're exposed to, um, the the better your perspective is going to be, right? And I I feel like that question's kind of answered in that, man. Like like I don't
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
fill up space with words, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Oh,
So
sorry. You know what? I can expand on that
yeah,
one more bit, right? The more industries that you touch, right? Jason, what is your day job? Like what is your day-to-day like? What do you do?
I'm a corporate safety person.
Yeah, you're a corporate safety
Yeah.
person, man. So if you start networking a lot, you're going to realize that in corporate safety, in litigation, in being an artist, in being a salesperson, you deal with a lot of the same issues that all these other careers deal with, right? Like getting people to understand the value of what you're doing for the company, getting somebody to work together with somebody else, dealing with a person that's difficult. Like everybody, no matter what role they're in, deals with this type of stuff, and that's all universally applicable, right? So like I guarantee you that there's something inside corporate safety that's applicable to just about every other field that you can then extrapolate. And conversely, in every other field, like learning from a lawyer how to negotiate, or learning from an engineer about how to be organized, there is stuff that you can add to corporate safety. right? So like at the end of the day, we're much more alike than we are than we are different, whether it be our personalities across, gender, race, and nationality, or be our job titles. So by networking, you get to add that perspective, and you really, really get to value the other, and you get to implement that into what you're doing. And that to me has been really the key to my short-term success right now. It's the fact that I've been networking so hard for the traditional careers for the last 15 years. And then I took this jump into just the forefront of digital entrepreneurship, and now connecting the dots between what the forefront of digital online entrepreneurship is doing with what the, Farah and Farah, the Morgan and Morgan lawyer guy that's on the billboard does, has a lot of opportunities, man. Like that type of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Even and like you said, everybody, every industry has something that you can get out of it. And when I do consulting, that's, like you said, every industry needs some kind of safety person. And so when I do my consulting, that's when I'm able to take my 9-to-5 hat off and do that. And I think that even when I do those, I learn something. And so even though it's paid networking basically, but I'm learning something and
Yeah.
able to get that feedback. So yeah, that's good.
Man. And the key is going in there understanding that you're not just showing up to teach them something, but
Mm-hmm.
you are also always able to learn something.
Yep. All right. Well, tell us about your gig, your consulting stuff. I see you. I like your picture on your main page. It's you jumping on the skyline.
Yeah, man, I like that picture too. So that
Yeah.
picture was before I left Miami. I left Miami to join this startup, right? That I came up here that it didn't work out. I invited all my, after about 10 years in Miami, I had started I was on the board of a couple different charities. I started a couple different young professionals groups. So before leaving the town, I wanted to invite all my, the people that I was a steward for, right? For community development. And I hosted them at one of my charities, and I gave this, what I call my TED talk in air quotes, of why networking is so valuable, how to do it fundamentally the right way, and a couple of tips and tricks of things that I've thought about. And I'm like, man, I want to have this like outrageous invitation. So I went out with my wife to Key Biscayne in Miami, and we took a couple of shots of me like jumping and doing like Michael Jackson spins and kicks. Um, but I digress, right?
Yeah.
Listen, man, my business has evolved very, very rapidly from beginning of 2019, starting to tell people I'm a professional networker and wanting to just speak on stages about networking and relationship building and the value of community creation for business development, to being an audience cultivation strategist. Now what I've done is I've taken all the concepts of what I know from person-to-person connection, which I speak about and I have workshops on, but I also can apply that by having learned the forefront of digital marketing and social media and how all that works. It's really all the same thing, man. It's just different ways to communicate, right? So if you can use these same tactics of relationship building, they work on social media and they work across every kind of channel. So what I do for people is I create and implement content creation vehicles for business owners that know that they need to be making content to attract new clients, nurture their existing clientele, and build community around their business without the business owner having to like sit there and think about what am I going to say on the camera. That's essentially the problem that I'm solving as a ongoing service, right? Like that is my B2B product. My B2C product is my speeches and the workshops that I do around networking. And I'm also, it's only happened once. It's actually about to happen a second time, but like my favorite thing is for someone that's going to a conference. It's just like, man, I don't want to go to a conference by myself. I need a hype man. I need a wingman.
Right.
They hire me to come with them, and I basically just like drop in and I make you the coolest guy at a conference.
Well, I might be giving you a shout one day.
Dude, man, it's my favorite thing to do.
There you go. Well, yeah, you just get to go and network. So
Yeah, listen, man, I basically, it all really boils down to the fact that I genuinely see something fascinating in everyone I meet, and that makes me an amazing hype man. right? Because I'm able to sing your praises because I'm genuinely fascinated by you, and then everybody that I meet, I'm able to say that to, and then I find something that they're great at, and then I just make it connect, and that's really at the core of it. It sounds very basic, but
Yeah.
it's worked out pretty well for me, man.
Yeah, now that you say that, I don't know, a lot of the listeners are veterans on this podcast, and I think that might be one thing that is a hindrance in our networking is that we don't always see the positive in someone right away. We always are guarded and we have our guard up. Um, even even if it's just a networking event where we're like, oh, this guy's got an angle, and I'm gonna see what it is before I actually start talking to him. Um, and I've my counterparts and friends and stuff when we go out to parties or social events, they're always oh, this guy over here is going to try to come over here and sell me his Avon or whatever, his
Yeah,
MLM or whatever it is. So I think we have our guard up, and a lot of times it could even be not so much sales, but they want to tell you their story and then try to one up your story. Everybody's got their battle stories, and so I think if anyone's listening that could learn from that, you got to look at the best in someone and kind of you know
yeah, man.
network that way.
What is it like? Listen, even that cheesy network marketer guy, like the MLM person, right? What can you learn from that person, right? Like, are they yeah, they're gonna come in and try to sell you their like CBD oil or whatever everybody's selling these days. But at the end of the day, be like, yeah, that's cool, man. Listen, not super interested in that. What are you passionate about, man? Like, how do you go about doing this? What do you like about CBD, right? Like, you can at the very least get educated on whatever the product is to then dispel the next MLM guy that comes at you. And when it's the story of like guys one up on each other, bro, I'm guilty of that too, right? Like I'm a guy, right? Like I like to story tell, but it's also I also get a lot of value from watching a guy story tell and what up me, right? Like what's working, what's likable. For a really long time, I didn't read books on relationship building and books like Never Eat Alone is kind of the quintessential, you know, book about networking. And for a long time, I didn't read that thing because I was just like, I never eat alone because I love networking with people. Why do I need to read this book? And then somebody I really respect told me to read it, so I read it, and I'm like, you know what? This book has number one, some of it really validates what I do. Some of it talks about what I do from a different angle, which is really, really interesting for a perspective. And then I learned a couple of other tricks from it, right? So now every time that I'm listening to a podcast and somebody has a book on relationship building and like the art of human connection or whatever, my initial reaction is still to be like, well, I don't really need to read that book because I'm the man at this. But then I've trained myself to be like, no. If I want to be the man at this, I should read that book, right? Because it's the iteration of seeing everything like that. And the most recent one was Brian Glazer, who wrote a book called Face to Face, The Art of Human Connection. And this guy is like a big time Hollywood executive that's produced every movie you've ever heard of, right? From like Splash to Apollo 13
Right.
to all these things with Ron Howard. And at first, it was a lot of stories about Hollywood, and he had this like really fascinating tactic about how he plans once a week a curiosity conversation where like he has a meeting with somebody that he knows nothing about, like a chess champion or an engineer from whatever, and he just meets face to face and learns from them. But what I really took away from this book was he was talking about the way that he would pitch stories and the way that he would pitch in Hollywood, and the idea that he didn't walk in and say, all right, so Splash. Do you remember the movie Splash? It's about Tom Hanks falls in love with Daryl Hannah, who's a mermaid, but he doesn't know she's a mermaid. It's like an '80s movie,
No, that
and
was before my time.
yeah, it's an icon, right? So I have my brother's 9 years older than me, man. So I've seen all these like old movies, and it's this iconic movie from the '80s, but it took him like 5 years to get it made because he kept on saying like, oh, this is a love story between a dude in New York falling in love with a mermaid, and people are like, who wants to hear about that? And then he started refining the way he pitches to saying, this is a story about someone seeking love and never really fitting in and blah, 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 right? So like when I go to convince people now, I don't go straight for the kill. I go into like, hey, at the base of what we're going to talk about is this, and this is what's going to happen and blah, 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 blah. And here's how I think you should do it, right? Because man, I could go on for a while, man. But, I took that from that book. And at the base of that is something else that I've learned at a conference from somebody that I don't really follow very much and I don't really connect with too much. But Dean Graziosi, who's a pretty famous dude. Really, really salesy. A little bit too salesy for me, man. But I heard him talk at Funnel Hacking Live, and he said something that just shook me to my core, which is that people don't do business with, grow close to, nurture bonds with, whatever, listen to people that they understand. People do business with, grow close to, nurture bonds with, listen to people they feel understand them. Right. So now I approach communication as like, all right, man, let me first try to show you that I understand you. Let me bring up something that you can definitely relate with, and then reverse engineer what I'm trying to influence to that like pain point that or that familiar feeling or that thing that is so universal. And that's been a super, super game changer for
I bet. Yeah, I have to look at that movie now.
me.
uh,
As a classic.
so I was born in '81, so I was probably too young to watch it back then. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, we're the same age, man. I was born in '80, right? But
there
it
you
was
go.
because I'm the youngest in my family. I'd watch all that crap.
Watch all the old movies.
Yeah.
So tell people how we can find you.
Connect with Pablo, right? Like that's what I want to people to do. And it's the name of my website, connectwithpablo.com. It's the name of my Instagram. It is my email address is youshould@connectwithpablo.com because I legit want to meet with everybody and be friends with everybody. I have a podcast out now called Chief Executive Connector, where I'm basically putting my network on display. And I go through my network and I talk about their stories, some really fascinating people, right? Like the youngest guy to ever take a company public in like the 90s is my first interview. I recently interviewed a good friend of mine who started a bank in 2009 at the bottom of the recession and just sold it, like, and he had never been a banker, like he had never worked in banking, started a bank from scratch, operated it for 10 years and just sold it at a sick multiple. And I basically go through and then my pride and joy, which is my 2019 last call, where I do this like storytelling rap and motivational speech over like a really cool beat about my experience in 2019. I really want like it's just like the coolest thing I've ever done, right? So I want everybody to check that thing out. But it's about showing you my network, showing you what I learned from everybody else, and going through all those stories and contextualizing that stuff. So to summarize, connect with Pablo anywhere. You should at Connect with Pablo. If you want to shoot me an email, I want to connect with anybody. Like I really do forge relationships with everybody possible because I see the wonder in everybody and I want to help everybody in the world. And I would love it if people would check out my podcast, Chief Executive Connector, which you can find on any platform.
Yeah, and I see you have your social links on your website also, so people can go to connectwithpablo.com, scroll to the bottom there. He's got all his Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff.
Yeah,
so I like your logo too. I'm a big logo guy.
You like the logo, man?
Yeah.
So that is my wife designed that logo, and
Yeah.
it's a pelican flying out of the sunrise.
Yep.
Because I love to surf, right? So like I'm out here on the East Coast. I see a lot of like sunrise sessions, and you always see these like pelicans skimming out, beautifully, and that's what it became, man.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, man. Thanks for sharing all your insight and bringing the value to all the listeners out there. With that, we'll sign off.
It's been a pleasure, man. I really appreciate you letting me speak to your audience, man. I really, really appreciate this.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Loading Podcast. You can support this podcast on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/leadershiploading to get access to exclusive content, chats, and a whole lot more. Again, that's patreon.com/leadershiploading, or visit our website, leadershiploading.com, for more options.